Berlin, autumn of 1942, stood as a fortress of intellectual certainty within the vaulted halls of the German High Command, where maps of Europe hung beneath iron chandeliers and the smell of tobacco smoke mingled with the confidence of men who believed their air defenses invincible. The American daylight bombing campaign had just begun its tentative strikes against the industrial heartland of the Third Reich, and in those early months, the results seemed to justify every ounce of German skepticism. Bombs scattered across farmland, craters, and empty fields, occasional grazing strikes against factory walls that left the machinery inside humming without interruption. German generals, steeped in the doctrine of blitzkrieg and tactical air support, gathered around intelligence reports that mapped the scattered damage with something approaching amusement, their laughter echoing through corridors lined with portraits of Prussian military heroes. The Americans spoke boldly of a revolutionary bomb site capable of dropping ordnance into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, a claim so fantastical that it seemed more appropriate for a carnival barker than a serious military power. And the Germans, who had developed their own Lotfe 7 optical bomb site and understood the practical limitations of high-altitude bombing, dismissed these boasts as propaganda designed to mask fundamental incompetence. The German scientific establishment, which had produced some of the most advanced military technology of the era, conducted their own assessments of Allied bombing capabilities and concluded that precision daylight bombing was a strategic fantasy, an American indulgence born from industrial abundance rather than tactical wisdom. Reports filtered through intelligence channels about a device called the Norden bomb site, supposedly so secret that its specifications were guarded more carefully than many weapons programs. Yet when German agents actually obtained detailed plans for the device in 1938, the response from military analysts was underwhelming. The technology appeared sophisticated in controlled conditions, but offered no meaningful advantage over existing German systems, and the practical challenges of high-altitude bombing through weather, flak, and fighter opposition seemed insurmountable regardless of the computing mechanisms involved. If stories like this captivate you, consider subscribing and tell us where you're watching from. It really helps us bring more stories like this your way. The early American bombing raids over occupied Europe in 1942 and early 1943 did little to challenge German assumptions about the futility of precision bombing, as B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators lumbered through hostile skies in tight formations, their bomb loads often scattering across vast areas with circular errors measuring in thousands of feet rather than the promised yards. German fighter pilots returned from intercept missions with reports of American formations struggling to maintain cohesion under fire, bombardiers releasing their payloads early or late, and the resulting damage patterns that showed no particular concentration on vital industrial targets. The Luftwaffe command studied reconnaissance photographs that revealed American bombs falling on residential neighborhoods far from intended targets, on agricultural land, on rivers and forests, creating a tapestry of destruction that appeared random rather than calculated. This apparent confirmation of a German technical superiority fed a dangerous complacency within the military establishment, a belief that, while American industrial capacity could produce bombers in staggering numbers, the fundamental challenge of accurate high-altitude bombing remained beyond their technical grasp. Yet beneath the surface of these early failures, American bomber crews and bombardiers were learning hard lessons that would transform the air war over Europe, lessons purchased with blood and wreckage across the hostile skies of the Third Reich. The Norden bomb site, despite German dismissals, represented a genuine technological achievement, a complex analog computer that calculated wind drift, airspeed, altitude, and trajectory in real time, allowing a skilled bombardier to adjust aim continuously during the bombing run. The device consisted of gyroscopes, mirrors, gears, and mechanical computers working in precise harmony, requiring the bombardier to input current conditions and then allowing the site itself to control the aircraft during the final approach to the target, effectively flying the bomber through a stable trajectory that maximized accuracy. The problem in those early months was not the technology itself, but the brutal realities of combat. Inexperienced crews operating under fire, mechanical failures at high altitude, weather conditions that obscured targets, and the simple fact that precision required practice, refinement, and systematic improvements that could only come through terrible trial and error. The transformation began not with a single breakthrough, but through a gradual accumulation of tactical improvements, better training protocols, refined target selection, and the painful elimination of every variable that degraded accuracy. American air commanders instituted rigorous bombardier schools where crews spent hundreds of hours practicing with the Norden sight, learning to compensate for wind, to steady their hands under pressure, to trust the mechanical calculations even when instinct screamed otherwise. Weather reconnaissance became more sophisticated, allowing mission planners to select days when visibility would be optimal and cloud cover minimal. Formation tactics evolved to maximize mutual defense while maintaining bombing precision, with lead bombardiers in the formation releasing first and following aircraft dropping on their signal, creating concentrated patterns of destruction rather than scattered impacts. The process was methodical, industrial, quintessentially American in its approach, identifying problems, measuring results, making adjustments, and repeating the cycle until the system achieved the desired outcome. By mid-1943, the character of the American bombing campaign began to shift in ways that the German High Command initially struggled to comprehend, as strike after strike began hitting targets with a consistency that could no longer be attributed to chance or exaggerate Allied propaganda. The Ruhr Valley, heart of German steel production and armaments manufacturing, became one of the first regions to experience the full weight of improved American precision bombing, with raids targeting specific factory complexes, power plants, and transportation infrastructure, rather than simply dropping ordnance across general urban areas. Reconnaissance photographs taken after these raids showed damage patterns that were disturbingly concentrated, bombs clustered around railway marshalling yards, crater chains walking directly through factory buildings, bridges collapsed with surgical precision. German industrial managers began reporting production disruptions that could not be easily repaired, not because entire cities had been leveled, but because specific bottlenecks in the manufacturing process had been identified and destroyed. The city of Cologne experienced this new phase of the air war in devastating fashion, as American bomber formations ignored the flak batteries and fighter opposition to deliver their payloads with terrifying accuracy against the city's strategic infrastructure. The railway yards that connected the Rhineland to the rest of the German transportation network were struck repeatedly, with bombs falling not randomly across the city, but concentrated on the specific rail junctions, repair facilities, and marshalling areas that kept the system functioning. The bridges spanning the Rhine, vital arteries for moving troops and material between the eastern and western fronts, became priority targets, and the Americans demonstrated that they could now hit these narrow structures with enough consistency to render them unusable. Factory complexes that produced everything from tank components to aircraft parts found themselves under systematic attack, not through area bombing that devastated everything around them, but through carefully aimed strikes that targeted assembly halls, power stations, and critical manufacturing facilities. The psychological impact on German military leadership proved as significant as the physical destruction, as the comfortable assumptions that had governed their thinking about Allied air power crumbled under the weight of empirical evidence that could no longer be dismissed or explained away. Intelligence officers who had once laughed at American claims now found themselves analyzing bombing patterns that demonstrated clear intent and improving capability, their reports taking on an increasingly urgent tone as they documented the systematic dismantling of German industrial capacity. The Lot 7 bomb site that German scientists had considered equivalent or superior to Allied technology became irrelevant in practical terms, because Germany no longer possessed the strategic bomber fleet, the industrial capacity, or the air superiority required to conduct similar operations against Allied targets. The entire German approach to air power, focused on tactical support for ground operations and defensive interceptor forces, had left them without effective means to strike back at the source of Allied bombing, the factories in Britain and America that produced aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Hamburg became the crucible where the full horror of precision bombing married to overwhelming force revealed itself in July 1943, during a series of combined British and American raids that the Germans codenamed Operation Gomorrah, an acknowledgement that ancient biblical destruction had found modern form in the skies over Germany. The British struck at night with area bombing that created firestorms of unprecedented intensity, while the Americans followed by day with precision strikes against specific targets within the devastated cityscape, a combination that maximized both psychological terror and strategic damage. The firestorm that engulfed Hamburg created temperatures so intense that asphalt streets melted into rivers of tar. Oxygen was sucked from basement shelters where thousands had taken refuge, and hurricane-force winds pulled people into the flames. Tens of thousands perished in a single night, and when dawn broke, American bombers arrived to strike at the port facilities, shipyards, and oil refineries, with the Norden bomb site guiding their ordnance onto targets that still smoldered from the night's devastation. The industrial city of Essen, home to the Krupp armament works that had armed German military forces for generations, felt the systematic attention of American precision bombing across dozens of raids that specifically targeted the massive factory complex. The Krupp facilities represented not just manufacturing capacity, but a symbol of German industrial might, sprawling across hundreds of acres with blast furnaces, rolling mills, assembly halls, and machine shops that produced everything from artillery pieces to tank armor. American bombardiers studied detailed photographs and intelligence reports that identified the most critical components of the complex, the power plants that supplied electricity, the rail connections that brought raw materials and shipped finished products, the specific buildings where final assembly occurred. Raid after raid concentrated ordnance on these vital points, creating cumulative damage that disrupted production schedules, forced evacuations of machinery to less efficient locations, and demonstrated that even the most heavily defended targets could be struck with enough accuracy to cause strategic harm. German civilians learned to measure their lives by the rhythm of air raid sirens and the silence that followed, their daily existence transformed into a calculation of survival probability, measured in minutes between alarms and the distance to the nearest shelter. Children carried gas masks to school as routinely as they carried books, their education interrupted by drills that sent them scrambling to reinforced basements, while teachers maintained calm with voices that betrayed underlying fear. Mothers developed the ability to distinguish between different types of aircraft engines by sound alone, knowing that the deep, synchronized drone of American bomber formations meant daylight precision strikes, while the unsynchronized roar of British heavies arriving after dark meant area bombing and firestorms. The social fabric of German cities frayed under this constant pressure as families made impossible decisions about whether to evacuate to the countryside or remain in cities where jobs and rations were more readily available, each choice carrying its own risks and uncertainties. American training films and public relations materials continued to emphasize the moral dimension of precision bombing, the argument that by striking specific military and industrial targets, rather than simply leveling cities, the United States was conducting a more ethical form of warfare. The reality proved more complex and morally ambiguous than the propaganda suggested, because precision was never perfect, and the margin of error at 20,000 feet could mean the difference between hitting a factory and hitting the residential neighborhood beside it. Weather obscured targets, smoke from fires blinded bombardiers, mechanical failures affected the Norden site's calculations, and simple human error under combat stress meant that bombs wandered off course despite the best technology and training. German civilians who lost family members and homes to American bombs that missed their intended targets by hundreds of yards experienced the same grief and loss as those killed in deliberate area bombing, the technical distinction between precision and area attacks offering no comfort to the bereaved. Yet when the Norden bomb site worked as designed, when weather conditions were favorable, when bombardiers had clear visibility and steady nerves, when all the variables aligned properly, the results demonstrated capabilities that had seemed impossible just months earlier. At the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Marienburg, American bombers delivered attacks so concentrated that aerial reconnaissance photographs appeared almost staged in their precision. Entire assembly halls collapsed into rubble, specific buildings targeted and destroyed while adjacent structures remained standing, production lines obliterated in single afternoon raids. Similar patterns emerged at ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, synthetic oil plants across the Ruhr, and countless other targets where the combination of intelligence, planning, technology, and execution achieved strategic effects that German defensive measures could not prevent. The cumulative impact of these strikes created bottlenecks throughout German war production, forcing dispersal of manufacturing to smaller facilities that were less efficient and harder to manage, diverting resources to repair and reconstruction rather than expansion, and gradually throttling the industrial capacity that sustained German military operations. The autumn and winter of 1943 became the crucible where German assumptions about air defense and industrial invulnerability were finally irrevocably shattered by the sustained weight of American precision bombing campaigns. Monthly statistics that German industrial planners compiled painted an increasingly dire picture. Production targets missed, delivery schedules disrupted, skilled workers killed or evacuated, raw materials stranded by destroyed transportation networks. The dispersal strategy that moved manufacturing underground and into smaller facilities succeeded in making German war production more resilient, but at tremendous cost and efficiency, with tank production that once occurred in massive factories now scattered across dozens of smaller workshops that required more labor, more coordination, and more transportation to achieve the same output. The German economy, already strained by years of total war, found itself forced to devote increasing percentages of its resources simply to repairing damage and maintaining production rather than expanding capacity, a defensive posture that could not win a war of industrial attrition against enemies whose factories operated beyond the range of German bombers. The strategic miscalculation that had led German military leaders to dismiss American bombing capabilities in 1942 now revealed itself as one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the war, because the time spent mocking Allied efforts rather than preparing defensive countermeasures could never be recovered. Anti-aircraft defenses that should have been distributed more effectively remained concentrated around obvious targets, leaving secondary manufacturing sites vulnerable to attack. Fighter production that should have been ramped up earlier to contest Allied air superiority was delayed by competing priorities and resource constraints. Industrial dispersal that should have begun preemptively only occurred reactively after facilities were already damaged, making the process chaotic and inefficient. German scientific expertise that might have developed countermeasures or improved defensive systems was often diverted to prestige weapons projects that consumed resources without strategic impact. By early 1944, American bombing formations flew over Germany with increasing impunity as long-range escort fighters solved the defensive vulnerability that had made deep penetration raids so costly in earlier months, and the combination of fighter protection and precision bombing created conditions that German air defenses could not effectively counter. The P-51 Mustang fighter, with its extended range and superior performance, could now accompany bomber formations all the way to Berlin and back, engaging Luftwaffe interceptors on equal or better terms, and gradually bleeding the German fighter force through attrition that could not be replaced. With fighter opposition diminished, American bombardiers could focus more completely on their targets, achieving accuracy rates that earlier crews would have considered impossible. The systematic destruction of German synthetic oil production facilities became a particular focus, targeting the plants that converted coal into gasoline and diesel fuel essential for military operations, strikes that directly threatened German mobility and operational capability across all theaters of war. The transformation was complete when German civilians, military leaders, and industrial managers could no longer distinguish hope from propaganda, when the daily reality of sustained precision bombing made clear that technical superiority and industrial capacity had decisively shifted to the Allies. The cities that had once seemed invulnerable now lived under constant threat from above, their air raid shelters packed every time sirens wailed, their hospitals overwhelmed with casualties, their fire brigades stretched beyond capacity, their population exhausted by the psychological strain of unending danger. Factory managers reported to Berlin with statistics that documented decline and disruption, numbers that could not be massaged or explained away through optimistic reinterpretation. Luftwaffe commanders acknowledged that they no longer controlled German airspace, that Allied aircraft operated over the Reich with a freedom that would have been unthinkable in 1942, that the air superiority Germany had enjoyed in the early war years had been comprehensively reversed. The laughter that had echoed through the halls of German high command in 1942, that dismissive contempt for American technical capabilities and strategic thinking, now seemed like an artifact from another age, a moment of hubris that history would judge with cold clarity. The generals who had mocked the idea of precision bombing from 20,000 feet had learned through bitter experience that technological innovation combined with industrial capacity and sustained operational pressure could achieve effects that traditional military thinking had not anticipated. The bomb sight that German scientists had considered underwhelming when they examined captured plans had proven itself not through theoretical capability, but through thousands of missions that gradually, systematically dismantled German industrial power. The Americans had promised they could hit a pickle barrel from high altitude, and while that specific claim remained more propaganda than reality, they had demonstrated something strategically more important: the ability to strike specific targets consistently enough to achieve cumulative effects that traditional area bombing could not accomplish. The lesson that emerged from the ruins of German cities was not simply about technology or tactics, but about the danger of intellectual arrogance that dismisses enemy capabilities based on initial performance rather than potential for improvement. German military excellence in the early war years had bred a confidence that became blindness, an assumption that technical and operational superiority could be maintained through force of will rather than continuous adaptation and innovation. The American approach to precision bombing demonstrated a different philosophy: identifying a strategic objective, developing technology to achieve it, accepting initial failures as learning opportunities, and systematically refining every element until the desired results were achieved. This iterative process of improvement, supported by industrial capacity that could absorb losses and replace aircraft faster than enemies could destroy them, ultimately proved more decisive than early technical superiority or tactical brilliance. The profound transformation in warfare that precision bombing represented extended beyond the immediate tactical and strategic impacts to reshape how future conflicts would be conducted and how military power would be projected across distances that ground forces could never traverse. The marriage of computing technology, aerial platforms, and explosive ordnance created a capability that would only grow more sophisticated and devastating in subsequent decades, as mechanical computers gave way to electronic systems, and eventually to satellite-guided munitions that could strike targets with accuracies measured in feet rather than hundreds of yards. The Germans who had dismissed precision bombing in 1942 could not have foreseen that they were witnessing the birth of a form of warfare that would dominate military thinking for generations, that the bombers struggling through hostile skies over the Ruhr were demonstrating principles that would shape conflicts from Korea to the present day. If this kind of storytelling inspires you, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us what topic you'd like to see next.